Earlier this summer, there was polite disagreement between the US Embassy and Beijing authorities over what constitutes a polluted and non-polluted day in the Chinese capital. The embassy has its own air quality monitor from which it releases reports via a Twitter feed. But these reports often differ greatly from those of Beijing's Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA declares a day of low pollution to be a blue sky day, depending on its readings. Differences in the size and type of particles measured, locations of the monitoring stations and other technicalities were cited, and Beijing residents were left to make up their own minds.
It's another blue sky day here in Beijing, or not, depending on whom you believe. And it's the differences in those measurements issued by the US Embassy and the city authorities which are symbolic of the much deeper differences between the two countries at the negotiations in Copenhagen this week.
Basically, Copenhagen hopes to come up with an answer to the question who does what, how much and when, and of course firm commitments from all those involved to act on the answers. The US and China, the world's largest carbon polluters, have been sniping at one another over a range of key issues: who should cut greenhouse gases, whether these efforts should be independently verified. Do the US and other rich countries owe developing countries, including China, a climate debt? The list goes on. Kim Karsten of the World Wildlife Fund is cautiously optimistic about a deal, but says the US-China element is crucial.
I think that given we will have 110 heads of state or heads of government coming here, I'm confident that these 110 people are coming here because they believe that a result can be achieved. If they did not believe that a result could be achieved, I do not think they would come. But I also think that there are a number of very big issues that have not been resolved yet. What is the level of long-term funding? What is the level of commitment? At the moment we see a big discussion between China and the US. China saying the US doesn't deliver enough, the US saying China doesn't deliver enough, and that discussion needs to be resolved one way.
Another question is what financial support the developed world will give developing countries. Analysts say around $100 billion a year is needed. Some want more.
Now I see an increasing convergence of opinions among developed countries to agree in the order of $10 billion annually over a coming 3 years until 2012. Now, more important thing would have come for a mid-term and longer-term financial support. That should be much bigger than $10 billion. Some countries have suggested that that should be in the order of at least $100 billion annually to be scaled up until 2020.
And further complications arose last week in Copenhagen when a group of the poorest and most vulnerable countries called for stricter emission reductions for both developed and major emerging economies like China and India.
The Danish text is an extremely dangerous document.
The poorest states look at China's per capita carbon footprint, see it's well above the global average and aren't happy. A first official draft deal was released in Copenhagen on Friday, but the posturing between China and the US, the developing and the developed countries, goes on. China's Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, He Yafei, says the priority for developing countries is still the reduction of poverty. But Chief US negotiator Todd Stern says his country won't do a deal unless major developing countries step up.
In terms of air quality measurement here in Beijing, it's enough simply to look out the window to find out what the real conditions are. Of course, the situation at the negotiations in Copenhagen is far more complicated. And air quality here in the city affects just the people living here. The decisions made by those governments in Copenhagen this week will affect the people of the entire planet. Fergus Thompson, BON.